I wasn't doo-doo, doo-doo. I wasn't listening for that kind of music. I wasn't freaked out at all. It was great. You're in this deep water, and you're just sitting back. And you can't drown. You can't be eaten by a wild fish of some sort. So in that sense, it was a very great experience. So I'm going to have you advance. Oh, let me see if I can advance it from here, if it works today. Hey. Whoop. Joseph, you're still on the screen. Why? Can we get to go to the next slide without? Yeah, thank you. And this will be the screen that I will keep up. Now, don't you see the guy over here? That's not one of us. You can actually read the newspaper while you're floating in this sea they call the Dead Sea. So there's no device. He's just laid back and he's floating. There's 33% salinity within this sea, higher than any other body of water on the planet. The Salt Sea or the Utah Lake over there in what do they call it? Salt Lake City. 9% salinity. This one in the Dead Sea, lowest elevation on planet Earth, 33% salinity. And so this is the result. You can actually float in this sea. And I want to read what the vision of Ezekiel is in chapter 47 of his book. And as we read this text, we'll talk a bit about the text, what it meant for Ezekiel in his day, what it might mean for you and I today. So Ezekiel 47, I will read verses 1 through 12. And just to give you a chance to stay alert and awake, if you care to stand, please do so for the reading of the word. If you need to remain seated, you're welcome to do that as well. But I'm going to invite you to stand if you want to, and we will read together Ezekiel 47, 1 to 12. Follow along or listen to the word being read. The prophet Ezekiel says, "Then he brought me back to the door of the house, and behold, water was flowing from under the threshold of the house toward the east, for the house faced east. And the water was flowing down from the right side of the house, from south of the altar. And he brought me out by way of the north gate and led me around on the outside of the outer gate by way of the gate that faces east. And behold, water was trickling from the south side." Commentators say that word trickling is onomatopoeic, meaning it's written in a poetic way that it sounds like the trickling of water. We'll just leave it there. Verse 3, when the man went out toward the east with a line in his hand, he measured 1,000 cubits, and he led me through water reaching the ankles. Now watch what happens to this water. Verse 4, again he measured 1,000 and led me through the water reaching the knees. Again he measured 1,000 and led me through water reaching the loins. You can see what is happening here inevitably. Verse 5, again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not ford, for the water had risen. Enough water to swim in, a river that could not be forded. And he said to me, "Son of man, have you seen this?" Then he brought me back to the bank of the river. Now when I had returned, behold, on the bank of the river there were very many trees on the one side and on the other. Then he said to me, "These waters go out toward the eastern region and go down into the Arabah. Then they go toward the sea, being made to flow into the sea, and the waters of the sea become fresh," literally healed. Of course, this is the Dead Sea, which lies just to the east and a bit south of Jerusalem. Verse 9, "And it will come about that every living creature which swarms in every place where the river goes will live, and there will be very many fish, for these waters go there, and the others become fresh, so that everything will live where the river goes. And it will come about that fishermen will stand beside it. From En-Gedi to En-Eglaim there will be a place for the spreading of nets. Their fish will be according to their kinds, like the fish of the great sea." Now what sea would that be? The Mediterranean to the west. "Very many." Verse 11, "But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh. They will be left for salt." In other words, the Dead Sea has some good usage for salt and developing those kinds of products. So it's not like it's all going to be gone. It'll still maintain some of its traditional usage, but the majority body of that water will become fresh waters. And then verse 12, lastly, "And by the river on its bank, on one side and on the other, will grow all kinds of trees for food. Their leaves will not wither, and their fruit will not fail. They will bear every month, because their water flows from the sanctuary, and their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for," there's that word healing again for the second time in the text, "they will be for healing." Let us pray. God, we do pray for your healing and your life-giving river to flow in us, through us, and in this place. Through Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen. You may be seated. The title of the message this morning is A Question, a Dead Sea or a Living River? And I ask this question rather metaphorically as we consider our lives, as we consider our homes, as we consider our church. Are these things dead spiritually, or is there genuine life in our personal life, in our homes, and in our church? Ultimately, taking this vision from Ezekiel, my desire is to see all of us flowing in the presence of God. The last verse of the book of Ezekiel kind of captures it all, where it simply says, and the Lord is there. And that's the ultimate place this vision goes to. The presence of God is there. And when the presence of God is there, wherever that may be, there will be life rather than death. And so let us consider the prophet Ezekiel for just a moment before I move to these three main points that I have for the sermon today: the other prophets and the apostles and the life-giving river, Ezekiel and the life-giving river, and then Jesus and this life-giving river. Just a few things about the prophecy of Ezekiel. There's 48 chapters in this book, and the context of Ezekiel is a context of war and death and judgment. Some 600 years or so before Jesus was a terrible time for Jewish people in Jerusalem and the surrounding region of Judea. The Babylonian army was coming through, and as they were going to come down, they were just going to ransack, devastate, and destroy everything. God was judging the city of Jerusalem. Things were going to be destroyed, and Ezekiel had the rather unpleasant task of proclaiming this message to the Jewish exiles who had been taken already into captivity into Babylon. And as you read the book, you would note that it divides nicely into two pieces, two halves. There's 48 chapters, but in the first 24, first half of the book, it's real strong on the idea of death and judgment. And then it moves towards hope in the second half of the book, the second 24 chapters. Within that first half, where death is such a theme, chapter 9, for instance, envisions 6 executioners walking through the city of Jerusalem. And this is the way Ezekiel prophesies to the people who are exiled already. Jews who are in Babylon hoping to come back to their city one day, but only to hear the prophet say, you don't want to go back there. There are executioners walking around with their weapons in hand, ready to render judgment. And to make it worse, in chapter 21 of Ezekiel, it's God himself who has drawn the sword, and God holds the sword in his hand. Clearly, the Lord about to render judgment on the once holy city of Jerusalem. And then ultimately, at the end of that first half of that book, chapter 24, is kind of the pinnacle and climax of all this death, where God says to Ezekiel, son of man, which he calls him throughout the book, meaning you're just mortal, you're just dust. Today I take from you the desire of your eyes. Your very wife will die with a blow. And she does. She dies mysteriously out of nowhere. And the prophet is not to mourn, weep, shed a tear, nothing. For the image is God's bride, Jerusalem, is about to die, and God won't shed a tear. It's strong judgment, strong theme of death. And this is the way the first half of the book ends, chapter 24, with the death of Ezekiel's wife. But thank God that's not where the book ends. There's another 24 chapters in where we see the prophet being reinvigorated with a new vision of God. A vision for a future, a vision for hope for Jerusalem, a vision for restoration, a vision for life that goes from chapter 25 to chapter 48. And especially at the end of the book, chapters 40 to 48, is devoted completely to a restored Jerusalem. Jerusalem, which had once been destroyed by the Babylonians, will be brand new and rebuilt, and there'll be a brand new temple, sanctuary of God, that is going to be revived and is going to be glorious beyond what they've seen in the past. And 40 to 48, all those chapters of Ezekiel are devoted to an elaborate description of what this new temple will look like in a future age. And guess what happens? The Jews do come back and they rebuild the temple, but it looks like nothing of what Ezekiel promised. It's a miniature model, the real thing. And so it's always left commentators of the book of Ezekiel to wonder, what is going on here? Because when the Jews came back, it wasn't fulfilled the way Ezekiel said it would be fulfilled. So what is it? Ezekiel got it wrong? Well, the community of faith isn't going to embrace that. Ezekiel's a genuine prophet of God. Is it to be a literal fulfillment yet in the future? Some might hold to that. Or is it a spiritualized fulfillment, perhaps even in the coming of Christ? Or is it a future age of some sort? Well, I don't intend to render a decision or an answer other than to say that we as the church are still left with the treasure of reading Ezekiel 47 today, in the context of which I have begun to provide for you. That in this context of death, there's a vision for life and a future that is yet to come. And what way to capture this vision of a future and life better than to take the Dead Sea and to bring it to life? When I traveled through Israel a few weeks ago, and I was impacted by the very many places that I went, I think my visit to the Dead Sea may have been the most impactful. Because the geography of the Holy Land very much impacts the theology within the world of the Bible on a number of different levels. For instance, the mountains of Jerusalem are seen as being a picture of the fortification of God and how God surrounds his people with his presence. The Dead Sea, on the other hand, is a picture of complete, utter desolation, destruction, death. Nothing good comes from there. And when we were there, we went up to the top of Masada in the southwestern corner of the Dead Sea. Masada, where Jews had a fortress where they held out in the first Roman war, about 70 to 73 AD. And Masada was a place of horrible tragedy. And what a rugged landscape it is as you climb that mountain, get to the top. You look out and see the Dead Sea and nothing but barren wilderness and desert. You can still look down and see the Roman army encampments from almost 2,000 years ago. And the question I kept asking myself is, if I was a Roman soldier, I'd be asking myself, Sarge? Or Captain? Why are we here? Who wants this landscape anyhow? Let them have it and let's go back to Rome. But they besieged Masada and finally climbed to the top and defeated the last remnant of Jews in that first Jewish war against the Romans in the first century. They're at the Dead Sea where there's nothing really to live for. And just across to the east, the nations of the Ammonites and the Edomites and the Moabites, all enemies of Israel back in the day, from which those people would come across to invade into Israel. In other words, the whole landscape, the region of the Dead Sea would have been a place that Ezekiel and fellow Jews would have known it's a place of destruction and death. It's a wasteland. It's a barren wilderness. Who wants it? What can you do with it other than you can get some salt out of it? But in Ezekiel's vision, what he sees is a river that will flow out of a new built temple in Jerusalem. And when that river flows, it's going to flow south and east, and it's going to widen, and it's going to get deeper, and as it goes down, it's going to make its way all the way to that barren land of the Dead Sea, and when it touches it, it's going to come to life. Remember the story from ancient Greece of the Midas touch? Remember that story of the king? Everything he touched turned to gold? That's kind of the picture for Ezekiel here. It's the presence of God. As it flows forward, it turns everything to gold or brings everything to life. Remember the story in the Old Testament? Elisha the prophet is dead and buried. And they take a man and they throw him into the tomb where Elisha is, and the man's body hits the bones of Elisha, and what happens? The man comes to life. It's that kind of a thing. You touch it and you live. Remember Jesus and the hem of the garment, the woman. If I could just touch the hem of his garment, and she does, what happens? Her issue of blood goes away, comes to life. This is the vision of the prophet Ezekiel. And what I want to speak to you and I today is that as we look at our lives, it might feel like a Dead Sea. Our homes may be like a Dead Sea. Our church at times may feel like a Dead Sea. But when we allow the river of God's presence to flow, when it begins to touch and move and we're willing to get into it, things begin to come alive. And what we find in the Bible, it's not just Ezekiel that has this kind of a vision for the Dead Sea coming to life, but there are others who, in lesser ways, speak similar kinds of things. Here's some examples in point number one of other prophets and apostles and what they had to say about the idea of a life-giving river. Both Isaiah and Micah, quoting each other. Isaiah 2, verses 2 to 3. Micah 4, 1 to 2. they talk about the mountain of the Lord being raised up, Jerusalem. And then they both say, and the nations will stream to Jerusalem. And that's the word that's used, stream, like a river. The opposite idea of the nations are coming to the center place of Jerusalem to hear the word of the Lord go forth. While we were there in Jerusalem, we saw that. We saw pilgrims, Christians from every nation, every different kind of denomination that you can imagine coming to make pilgrimage. People were streaming to Jerusalem to find God. To one extent, we see it happening today. But there seems to be a larger vision where all the nations, all the peoples, lay aside their other worldviews, lay aside their other religions, and they all come to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that the word of the Lord may go forth. Joel 3:18, he speaks of the mountains dripping with wine, the hills flowing with milk. Notice the verbiage here, dripping, flowing, the brooks flowing with water, a spring that will go out from the house of the Lord. Zechariah 14:8 speaks of living waters flowing out of Jerusalem towards both seas, east and west, not just the Dead Sea, but to the Mediterranean, in winter and in summer. God does not go on vacation in the summertime. God does not hibernate in the wintertime. His presence is there. In Revelation chapter 22, which, by the way, is the last chapter of the Bible. This is the end. And we find, moving out of the Old Testament prophets to John in the New Testament, concluding the Bible for us, Revelation 22, 1-2. The end of the story is a similar vision as Ezekiel 47. Do you remember Paul Harvey? I think I've mentioned him once in the past. Do you remember his famous tagline in his radio broadcast? What was his famous tagline? And now you know the rest of the story. Well, John does that for us. He's like Paul Harvey in Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2. And now you know the rest of the story. And the concluding chapter of the Bible begins with, and God showed me what did he show him? A river, a pure river of the water of life. And where's it flowing from? From the throne of God and from the Lamb. And when that river flows, there are trees on either side of the river for the healing of the nations, where the world is finally restored. And all of the evil and the sin and the problems that we know of in our very troubled world, whether it be the kinds of things that have been going on in Missouri, or the kinds of things going on in the Holy Land, or the kinds of things that ISIS is doing in Iraq, there is a vision that the prophets have. There is a vision that the apostles have, that when the river of God flows, it will heal the nations. And this is where history is going. But in the meantime, you and I as the church are privileged to live in that river. I think it's just a matter of us asking ourselves, do we just sit on the riverbank? Wow, that's a pretty river. Wow, look what God is doing over there. I think I'll sit over here. It's safe. And this is the way we approach it oftentimes, especially as Pentecostal Christians, where we get wet, we get baptized, we jump in. It gets a little bit messy sometimes. But I'll take that over sunbathing the whole time and not getting in the river. In fact, water's been a theme all week. How many of you took the ice challenge this week? Let's see a show of hands. Who did yeah, the youth pastor and all of his group. I got nominated by Joseph. I owe you one, don't I? I got nominated to do it. And how many know what I'm talking about? I'm talking about the ice challenge. All right, to raise awareness for Lou Gehrig's disease, which was promoted through Facebook, and you dump ice on yourself, that kind of thing. Well, so some of you have to do it this week, I suppose, huh? Well, anyhow, I just thought it was interesting as I was reading Ezekiel 47 and thinking about water flowing. That's what our modern culture is doing today. We're dumping water on one another for awareness of a particular kind of a disease. Well, this is the vision of Ezekiel, that there's a river of water of life that will flow, and we've got to get into it. The psalmist even said in Psalm 46:4, there is a river that makes glad the city of God. This is a strong biblical metaphor, strong image about the presence of God. But to the prophet Ezekiel, my second point, Ezekiel himself, who has the most sustained vision of the Dead Sea coming to life. In this vision of restoration in the second half of his book, the river is rising, as we saw, first to the ankles, then to the knees, then to the loins, and eventually it's overhead. It's almost a scary picture for the prophet. I'm going to be drowned in this deluge. It's really more a picture of baptism, of the presence of God as it flows. And Ezekiel, we see, had a tour guide, whomever this tour guide might be, some kind of heavenly messenger. And the heavenly messenger says to the prophet, "Son of man," listen to the question he asked him, "have you seen this?" It's a great, pertinent, and important question. And for us to answer on our own lives, have we seen the river? There are numerous Christians in our world who have never seen the river of God's presence, His power, His Spirit that flows. Let that not be said of us. We are Pentecostal Christians, and we believe in the divine power and the presence of God in this river that flows. And what is beautiful about this story here is that the tour guide takes Ezekiel and brings him back to the riverbank. In other words, he saves him from drowning. God ain't going to let us drown. When God's Spirit moves and we begin to move in gifts of the Spirit and allow the presence of God to move in our altars, you're not going to drown. It's kind of like a kid going in the water for the first time, like a 4-year-old or 3-year-old, and mom and dad's protecting them. In this context, God is not going to let us drown. And I got to do a little excursus here on this idea of a tour guide, because when we were in Israel, we had a tour guide. I just have to tell you this story because I found it funny. You might not, but our tour guide was named Brian. And Brian was a very brilliant scholar who had spent 20 years giving tours of the Holy Land. He was very good, very knowledgeable. And we boarded buses every day, and we went with Brian, our tour guide, and he lectured us all through the north, south, east, and west of Israel. I learned a lot from Brian, and